She's particularly interested in connecting methodological developments in trial design and analysis with clinical applications. And I know, for one, with our Pepper Center, we're very excited about the work she's going to be talking about today with the win ratio. So over to you, Lauren. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for the introduction and also the invitation. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about design considerations if you're interested in using the win ratio. So I'll start with a little bit of motivation, how I kind of came into this work. I'll give a little bit of background on the win ratio. If you're not familiar with it, don't worry, I wasn't either when I started. I'll go through a couple of case studies, some pros and cons, and then I'll introduce a little bit of the methods work that I have done with the win ratio, keeping that pretty high level. And then I'll end with a case study and application using the Remind trial. Please feel free to interrupt me or drop questions in the chat, and I can get to those at any point. So the motivation around this work that I have done was really around a grant proposal to study a new treatment strategy for a hospital-acquired bacterial pneumonia, which is one of the most common healthcare-associated infections. Study planning, of course, involved a discussion of endpoints and how are we going to decide if this new treatment strategy really works. And so we talked through a variety of endpoints, all of which had some various benefits and also challenges. So all-cause mortality is an FDA-preferred endpoint. Obviously, it's very objective and measurable. The challenge in this particular scenario is an issue with really large sample sizes, given that we're expecting pretty low event rates and would want to be able to detect a pretty small difference in mortality rates between arms here. The causal relationship in this particular setting also not always apparent. We talked about using clinical cure, which is an EMA preferred endpoint. Challenges here are around standardization of this endpoint and some subjectivity in really defining this outcome. Time to stability is frequent in community-acquired pneumonia trials, but has some challenges in the hospital-acquired setting due to things like duration of prior hospitalization and the use of mechanical ventilation. We also talked about some composites, so thinking about an outcome in terms of being alive and ventilator-free, really with the goal of kind of driving up the event rate to increase our power. A challenge in general with composite endpoints, and in particular in this setting, is really placing that equal emphasis on the outcomes, which can complicate the trial interpretation. So after a lot of discussion, we sort of landed on using 3 of these and incorporating them all in this win ratio strategy. So we decided to incorporate all-cause mortality, clinical cure, and ventilator-free days. So if you're sitting there thinking, what is the win ratio? I'll kind of talk through this a little bit to start. So the win ratio is really a new-ish method that has been popularized by Pocock and others in this paper reference here as an extension of a method that was used for combining mortality and a longitudinal outcome measure. And it's really emerged as sort of an innovative analytic strategy when you're thinking about evaluating efficacy in terms of a new intervention, particularly in the randomized trial setting. And it's really been used in settings where you have an interest in incorporating multiple endpoints within a single analysis, where you have a very clear prioritization of outcomes. And it's sort of an attractive alternative to that composite endpoint framework, where you have to place equal weight or emphasis on the multiple outcomes in your composite. So how does it work? The general idea is that each participant in your control arm is compared with each participant in your treatment arm in sort of a pairwise fashion. And so this is the algorithm that was proposed in the initial paper, where there were 2 levels to the win ratio. The first level being the survival endpoint and the second level being hospitalization endpoint. So I'll just talk through an example with this, and then I'll show you how it can be extended as well. So for every pair, you first make a comparison on your first endpoint and see if you can determine a winner or a loser for that pair. So in this particular example, we can see that, say, the treatment arm in yellow here, the yellow person there, survived longer. So that would be considered a win for the treatment arm for this particular pair. So if you can determine a winner on that first endpoint, you stop there. If you can't, let's say there's a scenario where 4-year follow-up period, both participants in the treatment and control arm survived to the end of the follow-up period, so you can't make a determination in terms of win-loss on that first endpoint, then they're considered a tie, and then you would move to a comparison on the second endpoint. So let's say, for example, it's hospitalization, and if we see that our treatment participant had a hospitalization first, then that would be considered a win for the control arm for this particular pair. So essentially you work your way through comparing all participants in your treatment arm to all participants in your control arm in this pairwise fashion. And then you sum up all the treatment wins and all the treatment losses, and your win ratio is essentially just the ratio of the number of wins to the number of losses for your treatment arm. And so in this particular example, we have a win ratio of 1.5, and you can interpret that as essentially the odds that a treatment participant is the winner if you're comparing any two treatment and control participants. A thing to point out, and I'll come back to this in a little bit also, is that if you have gotten to the last level of your algorithm and you still can't determine a winner, then that would be considered a tie, and it would drop out of the win ratio estimate. So the win ratio is conditional on being able to determine a win or a loss for each pair. We can also think about this in terms of a probability here, the denominator just being the number of non-tied pairs. So probability that the treatment patient would win would be 0.6 in this particular example. So there have been a number of use cases, primarily in the cardiology space. That was really where the first, the Pocock paper was published in that area, and really where it's been used most often to date. So this partner trial was a randomized trial comparing transcatheter aortic valve implantation versus a standard therapy. And it was really the first trial to use this hierarchical method that was sort of later coined the win ratio. And so for their win ratio algorithm, they considered 2 endpoints, death and rehospitalization. And if you look at the results here presented sort of in terms of the win ratio, they had 179 participants randomized to each arm, the active and the control arm, which results in just over 32,000 pairs. So think of every active arm paired with every control arm person. And so if you work your way through the win ratio algorithm, we can see that on the first endpoint for roughly 45% of the pairs, the active participant survived longer than the control participant, so that was considered a win for that arm. In 26% of the pairs, the control participant survived longer than the active participant, and so that would be considered losses for the active arm. And in 18% of those pairs, they were tied, so we couldn't determine a winner on the first endpoint. So either they both had a death at a similar time, or more likely they probably were censored or survived to the end of the follow-up period. So using that algorithm for those pairs, we then moved to the second endpoint, and they found that overall for 12% of pairs, the participant in the control arm had a rehospitalization first, and for 4% of the pairs, the active participant had a rehospitalization first. So overall, about 11% were ties, so couldn't determine a win-loss based on the win ratio algorithm. And so this resulted in a win ratio of 1.87. It was statistically significant, and useful to also see that this was largely driven by a difference in terms of that first outcome, death. So it's worth noting that this is consistent with the conventional composite outcome analysis. They did consider this composite endpoint of time to first event, so either rehospitalization or death. And you can see that there was a significant hazard ratio, so a similar interpretation, a similar conclusion using this sort of more traditional analysis. But something that's worth noting in this traditional composite analysis is that it does mask the participants who had a death after a rehospitalization, because the composite is really considering the time to first. So someone who has a hospitalization followed by death is really only counted in that analysis as the hospitalization. And so that's something that's a little bit more clear when you consider the win ratio approach. The win ratio also has this really nice benefit of allowing for various types of outcomes in your analysis. So it doesn't just have to rely on these binary outcomes in sort of the traditional composite outcome framework. So you can include things like repeat events, number of events, and other quantitative continuous outcomes as well. So this ATTRibute CM trial randomized 632 patients with a rare heart disease, and they were randomized to a TTR stabilizer or a placebo. And for their primary win ratio hierarchy, they incorporated 4 outcomes. So their first outcome was time to death. Their second outcome was number of hospitalizations. So again, not just that binary yes, no, they had a hospitalization, but actually incorporating how many repeat cardiovascular hospitalizations. Their third level incorporated a biomarker, so they used this NT-proBNP change from baseline. And worth noting here that they incorporated a margin for this outcome. So to determine a win or a loss, the difference had to be greater than some margin. It was 500 units for this particular outcome. And if they were different but within that margin, then it would be considered a tie and you would move to the next outcome. The last outcome in their algorithm was the 6-minute walk distance. And the win-loss here, there was no margin. It was just determined as a win or a loss if the change was not equal between the control and active participant. So if you look through here at the bottom of the results, they had a significant win ratio of 1.8. But you can see that it was largely driven by this difference in the NT-proBNP change from baseline. And so there was some concern as to whether that determining wins and losses on a biomarker that maybe the clinical relevance isn't totally clear was a little bit problematic from really being able to say that one treatment is better than another. So they did do a sensitivity analysis where they dropped the last 2 outcomes and just estimated the win ratio using the first 2 endpoints, so that time to death and the number of cardiovascular hospitalizations. And you can see that the win ratio was still significant, although a little bit attenuated, so closer to that null value of 1, but it remains significant. And you can see that that was largely driven by a difference on the second endpoint, the number of cardiovascular hospitalizations. So something that worth noting about this trial as well is that it actually highlighted sort of the challenges, or one challenge with the win ratio, and that would be defining that hierarchy. And it was actually noted that during the course of the trial, the algorithm for this primary analysis actually changed twice. So a careful consideration, definitely, in sort of thinking through the levels of your hierarchy and how you're going to prioritize them and what it would really mean to determine a win or loss on each of those endpoints. The last example I'll show here really highlights the utility of the win ratio in settings where maybe you have competing risks. So if you're interested in, let's say, a quantitative outcome, quality of life at maybe 2 years after treatment, but you have this challenge with competing risks. So maybe you have a death, for example, before you're able to observe that 2-year quality of life outcome. Perhaps particularly relevant in aging research when you have these other competing risks that may prevent you from observing your outcomes of interest. And so in this particular scenario, you're going to have this informative censoring, and standard or traditional analyses may introduce bias if you're sort of ignoring those missing data and not really handling that informative censoring appropriately. Now, of course, there are a variety of ways that you can handle the informative censoring appropriately, and the win ratio provides one approach to also handle this. So the Recharge-M trial is a trial that is ongoing, and it's seeking to compare two procedures that restore blood flow to arteries in the heart. And so they proposed a win ratio for their primary analysis that incorporates two outcomes, the first being time to death, and the second outcome incorporating this quality of life. So they're using the 12-item short form survey as their second level in the win ratio. And so within this framework, there's no scenario where you'd be trying to compare quality of life between a participant who dies within the follow-up period and a participant who survives within the follow-up period. So making it a little bit more fair of a comparison when you start to get to the second level of that quality of life outcome. Worth also noting here that they have collected the short form survey at several time points during follow-up, and they're incorporating a time average change from baseline when they make that comparison at the second level. And so the goal really is to capture the relevance to the patient. So do I know who lived longer? And if not, who experienced the better quality of life? So the trial is still ongoing, so no results to report on this one. So I've highlighted a lot of the advantages. You can incorporate multiple endpoints into a single analysis. It allows for various distributions, so you don't have to just have binary endpoints. You can have, time to, you can have continuous outcomes. You can incorporate margins on those continuous outcomes or not, really whatever makes sense from your sort of clinical perspective. It allows for this clear prioritization of the outcomes, and it's also pretty straightforward in terms of an interpretation. Particularly if you're thinking about comparing it to something like a hazard ratio, which, especially from sort of a patient perspective, can be challenging to interpret. So it does have that nice sort of straightforward interpretation. But I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge a lot of the limitations around it. And if you do any sort of Google search, you will see a handful of commentaries and editorials around challenges with the win ratio. And I think they're really important to understand these limitations if you are either designing your own trial or if you are trying to read the results of a study where they report the win ratio. So one of the limitations that's noted is actually also one of the strengths in this idea of prioritizing endpoints. And so there's some argument that if you have a composite of something like MI and stroke, how would you actually prioritize those if you wanted to use the win ratio framework? So there may be scenarios where it doesn't actually make sense to prioritize your outcomes. If you're incorporating sort of short-term symptomatic assessments and also long-term events, you may conflate this idea of long and short-term efficacy, and so maybe challenges around interpreting that when you have both short and long-term outcomes. This idea of statistical significance versus clinical significance, we saw this with the example of the NT-proBNP biomarker, in that you may be able to increase your power by breaking ties using a continuous endpoint where small differences might help you be able to break ties and ultimately increase the number of pairs included in the win ratio estimate. But it might be at the cost of, is this really clinically meaningful to say that someone won or lost, had a better outcome or a worse outcome based on a difference that might not really be clinically meaningful. Post hoc development, this is another concern that's been noted in the literature, and that's the idea of defining the win ratio algorithm after you started to look at the outcomes or results from the trial. And I would argue that this is a challenge of or a limitation of any post hoc analyses, regardless of what those analyses are. So just something to be cautious or aware of if you're reading results where they've used this as sort of a post hoc analysis. The last challenge, and I think is probably arguably the most important challenge, is this idea that the win ratio ignores ties. So if you work through your algorithm and you still can't determine a win or loss, those are considered ties and they drop out of the win ratio estimate. So the interpretation around the win ratio is really conditional on not being tied. And so I do think that that is a important limitation and really something to note when you're interpreting or reading interpretations of the win ratio, and that you could exaggerate the effect by dropping those tied pairs out. So one of the counter arguments to this is to also present the win difference as an absolute effect in addition to that ratio. So definitely be aware of the advantages as well as the limitations, and I'm certainly not putting this out there as the solution to every trial scenario. So with that, I'm going to move a little bit back into some of the methods work that I have done, particularly if you're thinking about designing a trial with the win ratio. So I'll just remind you of the motivation for the work. This was the grant proposal to see if we could use the win ratio in a setting for a treatment strategy for treating hospital-acquired pneumonia. We wanted to incorporate those three endpoints: all-cause mortality, clinical cure, and ventilator-free days. And we wanted to use that win ratio strategy. And so, of course, the next question for me was, well, what sample size do we need? To which I said, I have no idea. So I did some extensive digging into the literature, and this was probably 2021 when this was all starting. And at the time, there was very little in the literature in terms of sample size considerations. I believe there was one paper, and it was a pretty involved simulation framework where you had to make assumptions about each endpoint's underlying distribution, as well as the relationship between all of the endpoints. And we, at the time, just didn't have great preliminary data or anything from the literature to really inform those assumptions. So we were kind of struggling to come up with the right information to use that simulation framework. So we wanted to see is there a different way that we can think about a sample size calculation, knowing what we know about the win ratio. And so it turns out there's this really nice relationship between the win ratio and the rank distribution. And so a little bit of an illustration of this: if you think of a scenario where your first endpoint is time to death, you could think about ordering the participants based on survival time, right? So the first person at the top here is going to survive the longest. And so they would have the best outcome and thus the best rank, right? So if we took this information and we converted it to a rank, then I don't actually care about what the survival time or the survival distribution looks like. I just care about the rank. So I rank my participants from sort of best to worst. And then I think about how, in terms of their rank, how many wins would they have if I compared them to each other? And so this first participant who has the best rank is going to beat or win out against every other participant just by the nature of the rank, right? When we're estimating the win ratio, we don't care about the wins where two people from the same arm are being compared. We just care about the wins where someone from the treatment arm is being compared to someone from the control arm. So really what I care about is this number here. This participant has 5 wins because its rank is better than all 5 people in the control arm. And same with this person here. They also have 5 wins because they're better than all 5 participants in the control arm. And so we could estimate the win ratio just based on knowing what we know about the rank as the number of wins divided by the number of losses, or the number of wins for the control arm. And so we could estimate our win ratio there. So if we know this, then I don't actually care about that underlying time to event distribution. So what we proposed was a method to think about sample size calculation by simulating a rank distribution that corresponds to a hypothesized win ratio. And so we use this framework for power considerations under various sample sizes. So maybe what you're thinking is, okay, but why would you just have information on that first endpoint, right? In reality, you rarely have this nice complete rank distribution Otherwise, what's the point in using the win ratio in that scenario? In that scenario, all of my pairs are going to be decided on the first endpoint. So more likely than not, you have a scenario where you can't make all of your decisions on your first endpoint, so you have ties and you need to move to the second endpoint. So in my survival scenario, this has a very practical example of when this would occur, and that's when you have any sort of administrative censoring. So think about having your the end of your grant, right? We have a 5-year grant and we have to stop enrollment and stop follow-up before the end of that 5 years. And so really I have this censoring and I can't tell for these people who would have won in any pairs within those 4 people because all I know is that they survived to the end of the follow-up period. And so that's where I would get into the scenario of having ties on my first endpoint and I can't make those decisions. And so because of the win ratio framework, I could think about having a similar rank distribution on my second endpoint. And for anything that's paired, I would make a decision about the win or loss based on that second endpoint rank distribution. So my first endpoint might be a survival endpoint. My second endpoint might be a hospitalization endpoint, for example. But I don't actually care what those underlying event distributions look like. All I care about for estimating the win ratio is what does the rank distribution look like. So to extend this a little bit, we proposed this simulation framework with sort of a network approach. And so if you think of each node in your network representing a participant, so here I have 3 people in my treatment arm and I have 3 people in my control arm. Then I could assign them ranks and I could estimate the win ratio essentially based on the node degree of the ranks. So the edges connecting nodes are going to tell me if it was a win or a loss for the treatment arm. So an arrow pointing out of a node would be a win for that node. So for example, if I'm comparing T1 and C1 on the first endpoint, which this person has the better rank of 1, this person has the second rank of 2, then I would see that this would be a win for T1. And so for the win ratio, we just care about the edges connecting the treatment and control participants. And so I could estimate my win ratio using this sort of network framework, using the sort of node degree or the edges that indicate wins or losses. And so our framework was then, as I mentioned, extended to allow for the scenario where maybe we have censoring on the first endpoint. So all of these 4 nodes are all tied because of that censoring. So I can't determine a winner or a loser on that first endpoint, and that's where I would use the rank on the second endpoint. And so in that scenario, what we incorporated into the network framework is this idea of flipping the edge. If the win or loss determined by the second rank was didn't agree with the winner on the first rank. So in this scenario, this edge up here actually flips because I couldn't determine a winner on the first endpoint. I now have to compare the second endpoint, and I see that on the second endpoint, C1 actually has the better rank and would beat T1. And so we do this sort of like edge flipping to account for not having completely observed data on the first endpoint and having to make that decision on the second endpoint now. And so similar idea, you can see that the win ratio is the observed effect actually changes because of this one edge flip here. The last thing I didn't mention in the first sort of illustration of this is how we handle people who are ultimately going to drop out of the win ratio. So these people who ultimately become ties at the end of the win ratio algorithm. And so we wanted to incorporate that into the simulation framework because, of course, that is likely to happen. So we incorporated this assumption that either your best ranks or your worst ranks on the second endpoint might be tied. And that's really in settings where maybe the tie happens because of like lower limits of detection. So maybe all of the people who have the best outcomes are all tied at some threshold. So we made those 2 different assumptions, or we allowed for those 2 different assumptions in the simulation framework. So in this scenario, I'm going to say that my top three ranks on the second endpoint are all going to be tied. And so for any edge where I have to use the second rank to determine the win ratio, and those two ranks are tied, then those edges are going to essentially drop out of the win ratio estimate. And so you can see how that win ratio would be changed and ultimately means we have fewer pairs in the win ratio estimate. So really the proposed simulation framework is make an assumption about the effect size in terms of the win ratio. So I don't care what it is in terms of your time to death or in terms of your time to rehospitalization, but what are you hoping to be able to detect in terms of the win ratio? And so then the simulation framework, it uses this non-central hypergeometric distribution. So basically allows me to say, how could I simulate the ranks corresponding to a particular win ratio? And the current framework allows you to do this on on two endpoints, so a first and a second endpoint. And then because it's a reasonable assumption that your two endpoints would be correlated, we wanted to also be allowed to introduce this dependency between the ranks. So you can make an assumption about how correlated your rank distributions might be. The framework allows you to account for various assumptions. So, things like administrative censoring, what proportion might you expect on your first endpoint, and how many ties do you ultimately think are going to drop out of the win ratio at the end of the algorithm. And so we use this framework to allow you to estimate the observed win ratio based on the network framework, and then a simulation strategy to estimate power given a specified sample size, and it uses a bootstrap confidence interval approach. So I will not show you any of the simulation results. I have a reference to the paper at the end if you're interested in it, but basically we were able to show that the results in terms of power were consistent if we made assumptions just about the win ratio effect size, or if we made assumptions about those underlying event distributions that would correspond to a similar observed win ratio. So if you don't have that underlying event information, then you could use our framework instead. And so we showed some consistency in terms of power there. Okay, so the last thing that I want to kind of talk through here is just sort of a case study, a use case using the REMIND trial. So the REMIND trial was, and disclaimer, I was not involved in the REMIND trial, so a huge thank you to the team for letting me use the data to show how this can be used. So credit where credit is due there. So the REMIND trial was designed to help patients with type 2 diabetes who are also managing other chronic conditions, help them improve adherence and sort of better manage complex multi-drug regimens. And so the goal was to provide regimen information, guidance, as well as reminders. So this was a cluster randomized trial design where providers at 2 locations were randomized to one of 3 arms. So there was a usual care arm, and then there was a universal medication schedule arm, or UMS. And this incorporated an EHR tool that included things like med sheets with sort of tailored prescription information. And then the third arm was the UMS plus text reminders. And so they were sent for 7 days after baseline. And then following any sort of new prescription or a significant change in their regimen. And so the hypothesis was that compared to usual care, either the UMS or the UMS plus the text messaging would sort of result in better understanding of how patients are safely dosing their regimen, take prescriptions fewer times per day, so thinking about consolidation, and then also having greater adherence to the prescription regimen. So we thought this would be a good trial and good data to show how we might be able to use the win ratio in this kind of setting. So we wanted to consider 3 outcomes in the win ratio algorithm. We wanted the first outcome to be sort of like a hard clinical endpoint. We wanted the second outcome to be a patient-reported health outcome. And then because the trial was all about medication adherence, we wanted the third outcome to capture that in some way. So for the first endpoint, in just this first sort of preliminary results I'm going to show you, we considered blood pressure control. So whether or not they had controlled blood pressure at 6 months. The second outcome was then the PROMIS Global Health, also measured at 6 months. And then the third outcome was the ASC-12 total score, also at 6 months. So that's a measure of medication adherence. So before I show you the preliminary results using the win ratio, just for sort of comparison, I wanted to show some of the results from the primary and secondary analyses. And again, this was not my work, but I just thought it would be helpful to look at this here to kind of have a nice comparison. There were no differences in terms of blood pressure control or in terms of the ASC-12 adherence. The PROMIS was not actually reported in part of the primary and secondary results, so I don't have a p-value there, but if you look at the summaries of the means, for example, you'll see pretty consistent mean PROMIS Global Health across all of your arms. Similarly, for blood pressure control, it's pretty similar between the control and the UMS, and a little bit lower actually in the UMS plus the text reminder arm. And then also similarly, pretty consistent means in terms of that ASC-12 adherence, higher being worse here across arms. So we did this just for comparing the UMS to the control arm. So there were 243 patients in the UMS arm and 241 in the control arm, which results in just under 60,000 pairs. And so we first started with blood pressure control. And again, with the algorithm, we see for every pair, can we determine a win or a loss based on blood pressure control? So for 18.9% of the pairs, this would be considered a win for the UMS arm. So basically, the UMS participant had blood pressure control and the control arm participant or the usual care arm participant did not. For 18.7% of these pairs, it was the opposite. So the usual care participant had blood pressure control and the UMS participant did not. And then for 62% of these pairs, they either both had blood pressure control or they both did not have blood pressure control. So then we moved to our second endpoint for those tied pairs and looked at the PROMIS Global Health. And for 25%, there was a better PROMIS score for the UMS participant, and for 28%, there was better PROMIS Health score for the control participant. And over all of those pairs, there were still 9% that were tied pairs. And in that case, we moved to the last endpoint and compared that ASC-12 adherence score. And for 3%, the UMS participant had better adherence, and for 3.5%, the usual care participant had better adherence. So ultimately, this resulted in a win ratio of 0.94, so very close to a null value of 1. And you can see the confidence interval there overlapping with the null value. So not a statistically significant finding here, which we weren't totally surprised by given the primary and secondary analysis results as well. A couple of things to mention here. This is currently ignoring the cluster randomized design. So there has been very little in the literature about the win ratio in the setting of cluster randomization. So I think this is especially why I've kind of coined this preliminary findings, because I think it's worth exploring incorporating the design element into the win ratio, especially in terms of estimating that confidence interval. For next steps here, we'd also like to consider sort of defining different algorithms, not with an intention of how do we find the right algorithm to get a significant result, but really with the intention of understanding how different orderings, potentially different margins around the outcomes really inform that overall win ratio effect, so that we can use that information if we were thinking about designing the next trial. So, if you're designing the next trial, how do we pre-specify our win ratio algorithm? And so I think doing some exploration with some existing trial data is a good way to kind of set the stage for that. So with that, just a couple of quick acknowledgements here. So this was the team that was involved in the original methods work that I kind of illustrated. And if you are interested in any of the details around that, that is published in Contemporary Clinical Trials. And then, of course, a huge thank you to Mike Wolf and his team for the collaboration with the Remind trial data. And also for the invitation to chat here. So with that, sorry, last thing, a couple of reference here. If you are interested in designing a trial or are starting to see results presented in terms of a win ratio, these last three papers I think are really useful. They're more like guidance papers, sort of lessons learned. And then the third one is actually a lot of criticism of the win ratio, but I think it's really important to understand what those are and what those limitations are if you're designing or if you are just trying to interpret things that are in the literature. So I would recommend these last three papers as a good place to start. Okay, with that, I will stop here and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Lauren, for a great talk. This is Leah. I just volunteered. Mike isn't available, so I'm happy to moderate the Q&A. And maybe I'll go ahead and get you started with one. I'm pretty curious, you mentioned early on in your talk that the FDA, of course, likes these very clear endpoints. Mortality is an obvious one. It's extremely well defined. So do you have any sense of how the FDA may be viewing results from trials with the win ratio, since it's a relatively new methodology, and as you so clearly presented, it has a lot of pluses, but some real downsides as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the only reason I have an answer to that is because this actually just came up in another conversation. So we are going to try to apply this as a secondary analysis to a gastroenterology trial that I'm working on. And that was one of the questions was, well, what would the FDA think of this? And I don't have a specific answer on how they would definitively review a trial proposal that incorporated this. But I dug through the guidance, and they have a guidance, or at least a section on the guidance of composite endpoints. And they mention the use of different strategies for composite endpoints, and they don't call out the win ratio, but they cite the Pocock paper that is the win ratio paper. So I don't know that that necessarily means that it's the green light for every scenario, but I think that there is at least some precedent for using it in that way.
Great. Okay. Well, there's hope then. All right. There's a really nice question from Andrea Russell in the chat. If you do this analysis, is it important that the first outcome in the hierarchy is not especially common, so that like most participants die, for instance, or does that not necessarily matter?
I don't think I would make the decision on ordering in terms of the prevalence of the outcome. I think I would make it based on the priority. So in almost every example that I've seen, death is the first outcome because you really can't think of another outcome that would be of higher priority than that. And maybe there's a setting where it is, or maybe there's a setting where it's not a relevant outcome. But I don't think that I don't think I would choose an outcome just because it is a rare outcome to use as your first endpoint. But I think what you're getting at here is if every pair can be determined by your first outcome, then kind of what is the point of the win ratio? And I think that's a fair thing to think about. but there is this balance of if everybody has it, then you're tied. If everybody doesn't have it, then you're tied. So I think it's maybe a little bit more about the difference in the distribution between the arms. So I think I would think about it more in terms of clinical priority rather than prevalence.
Great. Okay, we've got another really nice question coming in on the chat. First, Stephanie Baccio, hopefully I'm saying that correct. Please jump in if I am not. Says it was a very helpful talk. Wants to know, is there any adjusted or stratified win ratio in case pairs are not comparable? For example, like if their baseline risks are particularly different.
Yeah, great question. So that original Pocock paper provided two frameworks. The one that I've kind of presented as you compare every pair of control and active participants, but also presented a stratified approach where you have to define upfront sort of risk sets or group people into similar sort of baseline risk categories, and then you make comparisons only within those risk groups. The original papers have all been primarily in randomized trial settings where you expect people to be similar between arms on average. So there's less of a concern of that in a randomized trial setting, but there has been some extension to the observational setting. And I think that's where it's really important to consider differences that might be unrelated to the treatment, right? And so I'm a little bit less familiar with it, but I believe there are some methods that involve propensity score weighting. So you can make more fair comparisons between your treatment and control arm, particularly in settings where they wouldn't have been randomized. I don't think that literature is quite as extensive in that setting, but I do think that it has been done.
Great. Oh, that's really interesting. I think, oh, here we go. Here's another one in the chat. Beyond clinical trials, could the win ratio also be applied to natural experiments? So are there additional considerations to keep in mind while applying to that case?
Yeah, I think if what you mean by natural experiment is more of like an observational setting, then yeah, I think the critical thing is to think about some way to control for that potential confounding. So either creating some sort of baseline risk categories or baseline groups where you say like, okay, this would be the most fair comparison within this group and do more of a stratified win ratio approach, or incorporate some sort of propensity score framework that would allow you to make them more comparable. But
Great.
let me know if I didn't quite understand the question.
I will monitor the chat here. That was a really nice question from Caroline Thirukumaran. We've got a question from Stephen Albert now. Do you think the win ratio would be helpful for cohort studies where death is a competing risk, say, if you're looking at, dementia studies, for instance?
Yeah, I think so. Again, just if you have some way to control for the potential confounding, assuming that you're trying to compare between some intervention that maybe is in a randomized setting. I feel like I would want to know a little bit more about the particular setting, but if you are interested in multiple outcomes and maybe your primary outcome is dementia, but you have death as a competing risk, then I think that would be a reasonable reason to use the win ratio in that kind of setting.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And I'll just let you know you've gotten several responses in the chat, people saying thanks for answering the questions so well too. So really nice engagement. I'll give people a chance maybe for one last question. In the meantime, Lauren, I'll toss another one out there. If you were to give some parting thoughts to people to take away from today's talk, and they're going about thinking about how this might matter for them in their work, what are the takeaways you would say are, when do you think of this as the thing you might want to consider?
Yeah, I think that I hope that you don't walk away from this wanting to use this in every possible scenario, or thinking that this is a great way to just have a statistically significant result when maybe you wouldn't otherwise with a more traditional analysis. That is not my intention. But I think if you had one takeaway, it would be the potential use of this, particularly in settings where you really do have a composite outcome. A composite outcome would be the most traditional analysis, and where maybe this would be an alternative approach if it was important to distinguish clinical priority in those composite endpoints. I think that would be the best use of the win ratio. And it also is good in small sample sizes. So scenarios where, death is an important outcome, but you're going to need an unreasonably large sample size to be powered for that. That might be a scenario where if there are other clinically important endpoints that you could incorporate, this would be a good framework.
Great. Well, I believe that's all our questions. Thank you so much, Lauren, for such a great, interesting, informative talk, bringing a lot of complex material to a broad audience and making it very understandable. It's very appreciated.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you all for joining us for Pepper Center Rounds. We're going to take a break in December, but we'll be back in January next year. Take care, everybody. Thank you again.